Welcome to Live Courageous Podcast, where we explore faith, leadership, healing, and the courage it takes to become who God has created you to be. I am your host, Musudeen, and today I want to talk to you about conflict, especially what happens when we know something needs to be addressed, and we will rather avoid it. Some people call it peace, but really it's avoidance. Think about it. Something happens between you and another person, and you know it bothers you, but you decide to say nothing. And maybe you don't want to have an argument. Maybe you don't want them to respond, or you're worried about bringing it up will make things get worse. You just leave it alone and tell yourself, you understand, it'll be okay. Or not talk about it at all, which will not resolve the conflict. The disagreement may still be there and it hurts. And maybe now you're carrying everything that can start changing the relationship. Your tone shifts and you may even pull away, or you may become making assumptions because about the other person or what they meant to say. And sometimes we know that's happening, but the conversation still feels harder than living with the distance it's creating. And I understand why. A lot of that can come from what that conflict has looked like in our own lives. If you've used to having conflict of someone yelling or punishment, rejection, or just someone shutting down, avoiding it may have become your way of protecting yourself. So when something needs to be addressed, your first instinct may still stay quiet. But as we grow, we have to learn that discomfort doesn't always mean something is wrong or unsafe. Sometimes a conversation feels uncomfortable simply because it matters, and avoiding it may end up doing more damage than even having good. I can't even count how many times I've told myself, and if I just ignore it or just let it go, it'll get better. I've done it at times in some relationships, whether it's a friend or a coworker or a family member. But what I've realized is that avoiding the conversation isn't actually resolving anything. It still had all of those feelings. I just wasn't saying them. And eventually, I had to realize that if something really needs to be addressed, staying silent isn't going to fix it. But deciding to have the conversation is only the first step. Then you actually have to figure out how to have it without making these things worse. And I think one of the hardest part of that is listening, because most of us go into conflict already thinking about everything we need for the other person to understand. So when they start talking and they say something we don't agree with, we immediately want to respond. Maybe they tell you what you said really hurt them, and your first instinct is to explain yourself. And that's usually the moment when listening becomes difficult. But you need to understand listening doesn't mean agreeing with everything that they're saying, or even taking responsibility for something that you didn't do. It means being willing to understand before defending yourself. Sometimes that sounds like, what did I miss? Or help me understand why it affects you that way. Asking those questions can give you room to hear something you may not have considered, But you got to remember and realize sometimes what you hear is uncomfortable because they really are telling you something you need to own up to. Even though you think that you have good intentions, they don't automatically ease the impact we had on somebody else. I remember I used to constantly explain myself when it came to conflicting conversations. But over the time, even though I knew what I meant, I realized that when I start by defending myself, I wasn't actually hearing what the other person was trying to tell me. But even though I started listening better, I realized I still had to respond. And that is where it became difficult. And that's where most people usually are. Just because you have something true to say doesn't mean every way is saying it's helpful. The way we respond can either move the conversation towards understanding or make the other person feel like they have to defend themselves all over again. That's why some people avoid conflict while other people walk into it already to unload everything they are feeling and call that honesty. You've probably heard someone say, I'm just being honest, after something was said in a way that was unnecessarily harsh. I have learned that if I genuinely want something to get better, I have to think about the way I'm speaking, if that's helping us get there. And if the real goal is to punish someone or to make them feel the hurt I'm feeling, I'm probably creating another wound instead of resolving the first one. That's why it helps to know what you want from the conversation. Maybe you need clarity, repair, or a boundary. Knowing that helps separate what you want to say so it does not become anger. And if you're too upset to do that, it's okay. Pause. Pausing is different from disappearing. You can say, I want to talk about this, but I don't think we can do it well right now. Can I come back to that? That's where self-control really matters. You can be hurt, angry, or frustrated and still choose to let those feelings control the way you speak. I've had moments where what I was trying to say may be true, but looking back, the way I said it didn't really reflect what I wanted the conversation to accomplish. And so when you slow down enough to think and listen about your own response, you may realize that not everything in the conflict belongs to the other person. There are some things you need to take responsibility for, and that's where apologizing comes in. Most of us know how to say, I'm sorry, but sometimes we apologize and immediately explain ourselves. I'm sorry, but I was stressed out. Or I'm sorry, but you don't understand what I'm dealing with. There may be context, but if every apology comes with a defense, the other person may never feel like we're understood or that you truly are accountable. Sometimes the apology needs to be simple, and you can do that by saying, I see that what affects you. I was wrong for that. And I want to handle it differently moving forward. There was a point where I finally apologized without adding a defense. And I realized how difficult that felt from apologizing while still trying to prove why I did what I did. The taking responsibility doesn't end when the apology is over. What you do afterwards matters too. And if you keep apologizing for the same thing, but continue to doing the same thing, eventually those words stop carrying weight. That's where true accountability comes in. If you recognize that something that you're doing is hurting another person, you also have to be willing to look at what needs to change. And that doesn't mean you're going to handle everything perfectly from that point forward, but there should always be an effort to do something differently than what was done before. And you have to remember, even when you or someone else takes responsibilities, apologizing and start making those changes, that doesn't mean that the relationship immediately goes back to where it was before. Some conflicts damage trust, and rebuilding trust can take longer than saying, I'm sorry, or a few weeks of accountability. That's also where forgiveness becomes complicated, because forgiving someone and trusting them again aren't necessarily the same thing. If the relationship is going to continue, trust may need to be rebuilt slowly, but consistently. And sometimes the healthiest outcome needed is accepting that the relationship cannot go back to exactly what it was. That can be hard when this isn't just a random person. Maybe it's your best friend, someone you spent years with, or someone you genuinely thought would always be a part of your life. Even though something needed to change, you can still be hurt by the fact that the relationship has changed. And that's where guilt can creep in. You start wondering if setting a boundary means you're being too hard. If forgiving them means you should just let everything go back to normal. But forgiveness doesn't automatically restore trust. You have to remember that. Even though you forgive someone, you still need to recognize that rebuilding the relationship is going to take time. But remember, a boundary doesn't have to come from bitterness. It can come from understanding what you need in order for that relationship to be healthy. Because no matter what the relationship, everyone needs boundary. So what I want you to realize is that forgiveness is about what you choose to carry in your heart. But reconciliation involves both people. And rebuilding trust takes both people too. And I think that brings us back to where we started. We began by talking about how easy it is to avoid conflict and call it peace. But working through conflict requires more than keeping things calm. You have to be willing to have the conversation, actually listen when the other person speaks, and think about your response instead of just reacting. Sometimes you realize there's something you need to own and apologize for. Other times, you may realize that you've said what needed to be said. And now you have to decide what's moving forward looks like. And through all of that, you have to accept that you cannot control the other person's response. You can communicate well, take responsibility for your part, and still not get the apology or the understanding or change you hope for. At that point, your responsibility is not to force the outcome. It's to know that you've handled your part as honestly and maturely as you could. And if faith is part of the way you live your life, This is one of those places where you can lean on it. Ask God for wisdom and see the situation clearly, and the humility to recognize what belongs to you and the self-control to not let anger or hurt make your decisions for you. So if there's conflict in your life right now, instead of asking, how do I make this go away? Ask yourself, what could it look like for me to handle this well? Maybe there's a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe you need to listen instead of immediately defending yourself. Maybe you need to own something you did or rethink how you have been communicating. And maybe the conversation has already happened. Forgiveness is there, but trust still needs time. You don't have to solve everything in one conversation. Just be willing to take the next healthy step, because conflict is going to happen. What matters is learning how to move through it without allowing fear, anger, pride, or even hurt to decide how you show up. And that's where real peace actually begins. If today's conversation encouraged you, share this episode with someone who might need it, and follow the Live Courageous podcast so you don't have to miss any future conversations. Live courageous, walk by faith.